I was in the middle of preparing for the funeral of my beloved mother-in-law, Donna, who had passed away recently, when my phone suddenly rang. "Don't you dare come to the funeral, go back to your parents' house in the countryside immediately,"
a stern voice ordered.
Confused, yet knowing better than to argue, I packed my things and left for my childhood home in rural Midwest. Later, I learned from my husband, Stephen, about his estranged sister, Daisy. "So, Mom's gone, how much of the inheritance do I get?" Daisy had asked, her words dripping with audacity. Her greed, even in the face of our loss, was unforgivable. From that moment, I resolved to protect Donna's legacy from her. After a heated confrontation, Daisy found herself behind bars, where she belonged. I'm Sarah, a typical housewife married to Stephen, a company employee. Our life together had always been simple, quiet, and full of love. I'd always heard about the tension between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law, with rumors of secret feuds and silent battles. For me, however, I was lucky. Donna and I had a close, loving relationship. She was kind, nurturing, and even taught me how to knit. "Sarah, what do you think of this cardigan I made? I thought it might suit you," she'd ask, always with a warm smile. "For me, it's beautiful, you're so talented,"
I'd reply,
grateful for her thoughtfulness. Donna had been more than a mother-in-law to me. She had been a second mother. She supported us, even financially at times. I loved her dearly, and I knew she loved me. But then, everything changed. The news came suddenly. Donna had passed away. I was devastated, unable to eat, unable to focus. It was hard to accept the reality of her loss, but I knew I had to carry on. Donna had been battling terminal cancer for a few years, undergoing chemotherapy. She'd never let on how much pain she was in. Every time I visited, she greeted me with a smile, always trying to protect us from her suffering. I couldn't bring myself to cry for her. I wanted to honor her memory with a smile. As I prepared to attend Donna's funeral at the family home, my phone rang again. This time, it was Stephen, sounding frantic. "Wait, what? You want me to go back to my parents' house?" I asked, confused. "There's a situation," he said, his voice tight. "I'll explain when we meet. Just go to your parents' house for now." I felt a sense of dread wash over me. Why the panic? What was going on? But if Stephen insisted,
I had no choice but to follow his instructions.
I drove to my parents' house in a daze, my mind filled with uncertainty. "Sarah, what's going on? Today's Donna's funeral, isn't it?" My parents looked just as confused as I felt. "I'll explain later, just let's talk inside," I replied, not wanting to get into details without Stephen there. An hour later, Stephen arrived, his face pale and his hand wrapped in a bandage. He looked exhausted and agitated. "What happened to your hand?" I asked, concerned. He winced, touching the injury. "I'll explain everything," he said, and proceeded to tell me about his sister, Daisy. Apparently, Daisy was 3 years older than Stephen and had always been a troublemaker. She'd run-ins with the law countless times, and Donna had always tried to cover for her. Donna had even gone into debt trying to protect Daisy, but after betraying her mother's trust, Daisy was cut off from the family years ago. Then, on the day of Donna's funeral, Daisy showed up uninvited. "So, Mom's dead, how much of the inheritance do I get?" she asked, completely indifferent to the grief of the occasion. Stephen, furious, told her that she had been disinherited long ago. Donna had made it clear that Daisy was no longer part of the family. Instead, everything had been left to me. "What? Who's Sarah?" Daisy demanded, her face contorting with rage when she realized the truth. The confrontation escalated, and in a fit of rage, Daisy grabbed Stephen's phone and stormed out, hurling insults at us as she left. Stephen's hand injury came from Daisy's violent outburst. I immediately locked the phone, but it seemed Daisy had gotten a hold of our address and my picture from the contacts. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about Daisy earlier," Stephen apologized, looking regretful. "It's a family issue. We decided to lay low for a while and stay at my parents' rural home for safety." A part of me wondered if this whole ordeal would blow over, but I couldn't shake the unease. Would Daisy come after me? What if she showed up and tried to hurt me? The days passed in relative peace, and for a while, I allowed myself to believe that things had settled down. But then, one morning, everything changed. "Are Stephen and Sarah home?" A police officer's voice interrupted my thoughts. I froze. What's going on? Our city home had been broken into. The officer explained that a neighbor had reported seeing a suspicious woman near our house recently, someone shouting, demanding Stephen pay her back. I immediately suspected it was Daisy. Could it be Daisy? Stephen asked, his face grim. After explaining everything to the police, the disruption at the funeral, the stolen phone, and Stephen's injury, they took down our statement. We were left to process what had happened and figure out how to proceed. The details of everything were still unclear to me. It seemed that when family was involved in a crime, things weren't so straightforward. Regardless, we were called back to the police station, led by the officer in charge. We entered a small room, and there, sitting in a chair, was Daisy. Her face was twisted with a mix of anger and defiance. Without missing a beat, she blurted out, "Stephen, how could you do this to your own family? This is unbelievable." Daisy showed no remorse. She didn't even seem to grasp that she'd done anything wrong. According to her, she hadn't come to the house with the intention to burglarize it. She claimed that she only wanted to discuss the inheritance, but since we were never home, she had no choice but to break in. As for the money she took, she argued it was necessary for her to stay somewhere nearby. In her mind,
everything was our fault.
What a selfish and short-sighted view of the situation. To think that someone like her, so dangerous and full of resentment, could have harmed me if we'd crossed paths alone, it made my blood run cold. Meanwhile, Stephen and Daisy were in the middle of a heated exchange. "You've got some nerve showing up after all these years, acting like you're part of the family. Give me back my phone," Stephen yelled, his voice rising with anger. Fine, I'll give it back. You locked it so quickly I couldn't even use it properly. But family is family, right?
Both Mom and I cut ties with you long ago.
Which means you have no right to the inheritance. Really? So, the old hag gives all her money to some stranger's daughter instead of her own flesh and blood? What was she thinking? Daisy sneered. Stop speaking ill of her. I couldn't take it any longer. I shouted at Daisy, my anger boiling over at her disrespect for Donna. Daisy glared at me, her expression turning even more disdainful. "Oh, you're the Christian woman, right? The one who stole the inheritance that was supposed to be mine?" "No, I didn't steal anything," I retorted, my voice shaking with frustration. "What do you mean by that?" Daisy advanced on me, her eyes narrowing with menace. I hate to admit it, but I could feel the fear rising within me as her gaze pinned me down. I was speechless for a moment. Daisy seemed to sense my weakness, smirking as she leaned in closer, her laugh sounding almost victorious. At that moment, the officer intervened. "Let's all calm down," he said firmly. "There's a lot to unpack here, but why don't you take some time as a family to talk it through? We can handle the legal matters later." He must have decided it was a family matter after hearing us argue. "You can discuss the charges and everything else later," he added, taking control of the situation. Soon after, we arranged a formal meeting at Donna's house. The living room was covered in thick carpets, and Donna's relatives gathered around a large table. Despite the tension, it was Daisy who spoke first. "Listen.
If you give me my share of the inheritance,
I'll let all the past go. You should be grateful for my generosity," she said, still as arrogant as ever. It was no surprise. Someone who hadn't changed in over a decade wouldn't suddenly become reasonable. Every time she spoke, it was the same: give me the inheritance, drop the charges. But we weren't about to give in to her demands. We'd said it time and time again: you've been disinherited. You're not entitled to any of Mom's inheritance. "Well, then why don't you give me some money once you get the inheritance?" Daisy shot back, as though her suggestion was reasonable. "There's no way that absurd idea is going to fly," Stephen responded, clearly exasperated. I stepped in to calm him down, then turned to Daisy, keeping my voice steady. "Daisy, did you actually read Donna's will? There was a part about you too." "I'm only interested in the inheritance part. The rest is just her complaints about me," she said dismissively. "No, Donna cared about you. She felt regret about how things turned out," I said, my voice softening. "She never stopped worrying about you." "Well, if she cared so much, she should have given me the inheritance," Daisy scoffed, rolling her eyes. She was just a fool. Her words stung, but I couldn't let her disrespect Donna like this. "Donna didn't give you any money because she knew you'd never change," I said, my voice firm. "I won't let someone like you get even a cent of Donna's legacy." "Who are you to talk? You're not even blood related," Daisy sneered. "You're one to talk," I shot back. "You discarded your own blood ties a long time ago." For a brief moment, Daisy faltered, her eyes narrowing into a dangerous glare. But this time, I didn't look away. There's nothing more to discuss. Please leave now, I said, holding her gaze with determination. Out of nowhere, Daisy lunged at me, either out of rage or fear, but she was quickly restrained by Stephen and other family members. 10 minutes later, the police arrived and escorted her out of the house. She continued shouting insults, but by the time she was put into the patrol car, her spirit had broken. She slumped in her seat, defeated. Later, I learned that Daisy ended up in prison. Our report had been officially accepted, and the police discovered she was deep in debt to loan sharks. Her desperation for Donna's inheritance was likely driven by her financial troubles. In the end, she had made her choices, and now she had to face the consequences. She didn't understand the meaning of true love or family. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. As Stephen and I reflected on everything that had happened, our home finally felt peaceful again. Donna's portrait sat on the mantel, and Stephen lit incense in her memory. He turned to me, surprised. I didn't expect you to argue so boldly, Sarah. I read Donna's will again. I replied softly. I hadn't really looked at it thoroughly before. It was filled with her heartfelt emotions, like a letter. Every word she wrote stirred something deep inside me. I looked down at the cardigan Donna had knit for me, my chest tight with emotion. She was so concerned about her own child. She wanted to do so much for her. I'll never forget that. I wiped a tear from my cheek, and Stephen, sensing my sadness, tried to cheer me up. Sarah, would you knit something for me too? Of course, I'll show you how Mom used to do it, I said, smiling through my tears. We'll make good use of her inheritance. From that moment on, I promised myself I would live a joyful life, not just for Stephen, but for Donna, too.